I'm Rick Brettell, and welcome to this beautiful and really wonderful space. When John died in this big bed that was right there, we had a little meeting of a bunch of people who knew John and thought about, what we would do in the aftermath of his death, and we were meeting, and his fantastic brother. I mean, if any of us could pick one person to be their brother, it would be David. And I don't have any brothers, so I've got first dibs. Anyway, we as we were sitting here, the kind of vibes in this place, and it was very different for those of you who knew John. This wall was a brick wall, and on it were hundreds of works of art arranged in an incredible manner, and there was this huge bed over there that was brought from up here, and it had a kind of feeling of a loft that was the result of a very long and very well-lived life. And in thinking about how to create a situation in which people could really come to an understanding of John's work in the best way, in a way that was non-commercial, in a way that was honest, and also well documented and clear, we decided to ask David if the space itself could be transformed into sort of a gallery space. And so Gary Cunningham designed the walls and worked with David Gibson to kind of make it into the white box that it is now. The tree survived, thank God. It's had a lot of ill care through the years, but it seems to defy all of that. And we began to commence a kind of process of introducing people to John's work. The first installation was done by Barry Whistler, who knows John's work longer and better than anyone except his brother, and who did an exhibition of the work that we all really have come to associate with John at his finest. And I decided that I wanted to look at the beginnings of John's career and how he became an artist and the ways in which he had to get out of Texas in order to make manifest certain of his ideas about form and material. And this exhibition resulted from it. And David and I actually installed it together. And we installed everything that we thought we would install. And there are a few important works of art from this period that aren't up because we have ideas for them about future installations. And what I think that all of you should know is that this will be the second in a series of installations done from John's work that will reveal different aspects of that work, sometimes chronologically and sometimes thematically. And they'll all be done in this simple way with no labels and a very simple description and a kind of freedom for the viewer who can come and think whatever he or she wants to think. As we began to work on this, it became clear to me that though I thought I knew John's work very well, I in fact didn't. And this exhibition was a proof of that, because of course all of these things, I had no concept that John had ever made works like this. And we thought that it would be actually rather interesting to document the installations and to get other people to reflect on the nature of John's achievement as an artist. And so the first person we asked to write an essay about this portion of John's work was Gabe Ritter, who has been hopefully having fun and working on this essay for a while. And what we're going to do is publish a series of very small books that will have commissioned essays, photographs of the installation, very good photographs of each of the works of art in the installation, and a chronology of John's work covered by the installation. And the bulk of the work really is done by David, because David has kind of taken a year off of his very busy life as a psychoanalyst in Boston to devote himself to the documentation and care of his brother's work. And what has resulted from that is an amazing documentation, a very good photographic documentation, a very clear understanding of everything that survives, produced by John, whether on paper or on canvas or on other material. And a very sort of well-developed chronology of John's work, particularly using John's notebooks and written material. So as we have begun to work on his career in a really serious way, the person who's taken the most care of that in terms of documentation has been David, who understood his brother better than anyone. And so what we're going to do in this space is do a series of installations. And we've been talking about 2 or maybe even 3 more after this, because even though John's life was not a long life, it was longer than Van Gogh and it was longer than some Seurat and other short-lived artists, but it was not a full life. And in spite of that fact, he left a very distinguished and large and varied body of work. And for that reason, we're going to do a series of small books, and we're going to commission a series of essays and invite people to come and look at the work of art in a way that's different from going to a museum and different from going to a commercial gallery, and has a kind of intimacy and directness that those 2 experiences don't have. So I thought for tonight I would do the little basic thing, which has been a bit long, and then ask David to talk a little bit about John's period of time in California when all of this work was made in the early 1980s. This is John getting out of Texas and going not to New York, where he went later on, but going to California. And David will talk to us a little bit about where he went, why he went, what he did, who he met, and give us a little bit of biographical context for it. And then we'll do a chat with Gabe. So.
Okay, great. Thank you, Rick. So I'm just going to paint the context in a life narrative about this period of time for John. He was, let's start in the year 1977. He had finished his BFA at Colorado College and had really had a very good tenure there and had decided to go on for an MFA and was looking to go to Pomona. So he was accepted at Pomona, graduated in June of 77, and then went to LA in August, tried to find an apartment. Had never been in a major big city like that, and spent 2 days in LA and said, I'm not going to do this. So he turned around and came back to Texas. And that was a very critical time for him because he had been sort of focusing on being an artist and sort of accruing the markers, if you will, that one gets, either a BFA, MFA. And he decided he would jettison that and spent about 7 months in Denison. I don't know if you're from around here, you might know Denison up on the Red River. That's where we grew up. And he did some painting, but just tried to figure out what to do next. And he, on really a little bit of recommendation from other people, sent out letters to different museums, hoping to get something, anything working in a museum? Well, he landed a slot in the mailroom of the Fort Worth Art Museum. There he met Barry Whistler and Joe Fawbush, and this was in January of '78. He then spent about 9 months there, met a range of artists who came through the museum, learned a lot about how museums work, and then grew tired of that and spent about 9 months in Austin. Still, he was trying to figure out, how do I become a painter? He had tried museum work. He had, in Austin, had done some work with the Texas Commission on the Arts, and came back to Denison in it would have been probably early '80, and got a little house and did 2 paintings. This is one of them, Thunderbird, Atomic Thunderbird. And he knew he needed to get out of Denison if he was going to paint. So with a good friend in California, he went to Santa Barbara and found a room in an old bunkhouse on a ranch that had cattle and avocado groves overlooking the Pacific. He had 2 roommates. One was a very flamboyant, strong personality fellow who was a musicologist and played the organ. I mean, and he really knew about organs. So the other roommate was a Japanese woman who barely spoke English, who was a practicing Buddhist. So every morning, John would wake up to Buddhist chants. And then in the afternoon, he would hear Val rant about, whatever was going on at the church. And in the course of 12 months, he painted 12 or 13 canvases. And you'll see, most all of these here he did in that year. And I have notes from him saying, I'm trying to do a canvas a month. And if you take a minute to look at these and the complexity of them, I really don't know how he did that. He loved California. He had a very good friend out there, and it was a very important time for him. They ultimately got kicked off the ranch. He went to live on Rincon Point, if any of you know that part of California, and then came back to Denison in April of '82. And spent about a year in North Texas painting. He did Fossil, which is up here on the wall. Lived at our lake house. We have a small lake house up on Lake Texoma. And then in the summer of '82, went with Joe Fawbush, who he had met at the Fort Worth Museum, who was now in New York, running Fawbush Editions, went with Joe and his partner Tommy and an artist named Judy Rifka. They all headed off to Documentus 7. So he had this expansive trip to Europe, to Documentus 7, and then came back to Denison and Dallas and worked some more. And that is the context in which all of this work was created. I really feel for John, these works represent for him this whole effort. And John could be very hardworking when he wanted to be, and that was most of the time. He really was pushing to see if he could become a painter. And I think what we see on these walls are the fruits of that labor. So that's the context historically for where we are.
Gabe came innocent and delighted and all of that to Dallas without any idea that he would be confronted with artists who had full-blown careers, who he could never meet, but whose works of art would be part of the visual world in which he lived. Gabe was at this first dinner in which we discussed what we're going to do with John's legacy. And when David and I asked Gabe if he would write about the California work, given the fact that he has come to us from California, knows California art really well, we were absolutely thrilled that he said yes. And so I will say nothing more, but ask you to.
Well, I can give, David, thank you for the kind of biographical context. I can maybe give a little bit more art historical context to what was going on in Pomona, what was going on in Los Angeles and in California around those dates, and then maybe we can talk about the work a little bit. So actually, through doing my research, it became a huge what if he had gone to Pomona. Because Pomona, around the time he would have been there, he kind of just missed the apex of their kind of experimental work that they were doing, which was kind of late 60s, early 70s. Pomona was really a hotbed of activity for both conceptual art in California and also the light and space movement. And in particularly, there were two curators, Hal Glicksman, who was only there for a year but brought on very important exhibitions by, and also I should say faculty came on later on, people like James Turrell, but we're talking exhibitions with Michael Asher, Chris Burden, Jack Goldstein, why am I spacing on his name right now? John Baldessari. And he was also joined by another curator, Helene Weiner, who I don't know if that's a name that's familiar to some people, but she then went on to become hugely successful as the partner of Metro Pictures in New York, who represents or represented and continues to the kind of pictures generation from the 1980s. And this, I think, was a time where she was bringing artists into Pomona that she was interested in. Also, this gentleman, Glicksman, was also bringing in hugely influential artists. And while I can't really say that, I think at the end of the day, especially when you read through some of the John's notes, he references people like Matt Mulliken, who would have been an artist from California who was definitely involved not only with Pomona, but with Southern California at the time. These very graphic, very bold kind of design-like signage. But then other artists, you know, especially someone like Agnes Martin, someone like Mark Rothko, these are not people who were in California. So, but I think at the end of the day, those are really probably the most influential artists I would guess to John's development. But the people he would have, he was living out in Carpinteria. I don't know if you mentioned that, Santa Barbara, which is a kind of sleepy seaside town where I don't think much was going on other than the seaside. And so I think a lot of the work you see is also influenced by a Southern California palette of just being by the coast, seeing sunrises. I mean, you can also read into a lot of these works what was going on in terms of the light and space movement in Southern California. These are artists that were more interested in the kind of phenomenological experience of art, looking at the like optical illusion, people like Robert Irwin, Craig Kaufman, people playing with. You had artists that were kind of coming in after minimalism, which was predominantly East Coast, and what was happening on the West Coast is you had artists that were playing with color, still playing with these very minimal, very geometric forms, but influenced by new materials that were coming into Southern California because of, I'm forgetting specifically which plane manufacturer there was, but a lot of the jets and JPL has always been down Southern California, and I'm forgetting which other airline, but it may have been Hughes. The technology that was being used to manufacture the planes was then being taken up by these artists who were using injection molded acrylics and resins and things like that. And someone like Craig Kaufman, these kind of luminescent, almost pill-shape wall-mounted sculptures that resonate similar to a piece behind you like Godplug, but I honestly don't know if they were on the same path or on the same wavelength. But the conceptual art that was going on there, I think also must have been people he either works he saw, shows he went down to see. There's notes of a lot of travel back and forth to Los Angeles, even to New York at the time. So he would have been seeing work of John Baldessari, really early photo-conceptual work. And I don't think that necessarily finds its way into this body. And I think that is primarily because John was working with a very private vocabulary, somewhere in between abstraction, and some of them are more almost these signs, these symbols, the atomic Thunderbird, the Thunderbird coming from Native American mythology, and it was known to kind of be the bringer of both destruction via thunderclaps, but also lightning, but also the bringer of the rain. This, interesting though, is atomic Thunderbird, and this kind of instant of destruction then matched with the atomic power and radiation. The sign actually is very similar. So if you imagine the bottom is the sort of the tail feathers, and the top is the wingspan. This is a very abstracted form, but it does look like a lot of Native American imagery of this Thunderbird mythological creature. It also, for me, though, looks like a Tiffany lamp. and I think his color palette, especially here—
Or a bomb.
Yeah, well, and a bomb, and the atoms and this kind of fragmentation that's going on. This, and there's another piece, and I don't know if it's out now, Accurate TV, right. Okay, it's all right. Which is more of a collage piece. So I think even with this palette, there may have also been, who knows who he may have overlapped with, but some of the LA funk scene, people like Ed Keenholz. But there's also someone who isn't mentioned in any of the literature or his notes, but someone maybe like John McLaughlin, who, this hard edge LA abstraction that predates light and space, but I think you see in the color palette and also these very geometric forms. But I think at the end of the day, John had a very spiritual side to him, very deeply religious, or religious upbringing, I should say, which also was, I think, incredibly conflicting for him, or conflicted, I should say. And looking at these works, if you were to say it's related to, conceptual or minimal forms, it's related to light and space. What those were doing was trying to take out any sense of the hand, but also religiosity, spirituality, and that is very present in this work, which I think makes it very interesting. I think, to your point, that this was like 2 years span was incredibly productive for John, but I think it was also an incredibly frustrating time for him. I think from notes and also just reading other things, he was incredibly lonely. I think he was very frustrated about, trying to become an artist and doing that on his own. Also just not having a significant other in his life. And a painting like this from '81 titled Sane, I think is a really important indicator of his mental space. This kind of downward spiral, but also an upward spiral. It kind of references, I think, it's not specifically the Fibonacci series, but he has these interesting number notations to figure out the way he wanted this coil to work. And I think it references his time there, this kind of flue that was
flue panel that dissipates heat.
right, and that he had in the home in Carpinteria. Was it there or was it?
Ranch bunkhouse.
Okay, the ranch bunkhouse. And he mentions that the blue, it was this way for him to kind of soothe his unhappiness. And I think he doesn't necessarily, well, he sort of mentions it in this one text where he kind of felt a void in his life. And I think on the one hand, literally just filling the canvas was on the one hand filling the void, but on the other hand, there was also this void in his life where he was kind of hoping for companionship and was just not finding it out there in California. And so I think he was in, on the one hand, a very dark place, but then it's interesting at the end of this one note that he wrote to himself that starts off in, I think, quite a dark place. He then, by the end of it, is kind of pumping himself up, and he's saying, I got to get out there, I got to be more active, I need to be social, I need to, he doesn't say it, but I need to go live. And for me, the way I'm reading this is that there's a kind of downward spiral into the depression he was experiencing at the time, but then also kind of in the reverse form, a spiral up, this kind of building himself up to go on. And even a piece like this over here, which has it seems somewhat innocuous, but with a title like "Please Don't Worry," and him being away from home, and it being somewhat of a coffin-like shape. There are all these. He seems to be alluding to certain things. There's also notations that talk about this as not only as a coffin, but as a vessel for resurrection. And that kind of playing off of his own spirituality. So I think you get a sense in this body of work that he was trying to find himself, having difficulty, but at the same time being incredibly productive as an artist.
But there's so little difficulty manifest in the work. Mm-hmm. The work is very confident and clear to me.
Yeah, and I think this note that you're referencing, which I shared with you, John really turned to his art was something he knew. It was always an anchor, and so despite everything else going on, it was always what he really knew and did. So it was sort of fulfillment through action.
What's interesting to me about what you say is that in a certain sense, he didn't need to be in California to make these.
And I was thinking about that. I was, in terms of...
He needed to be away from home,
maybe he didn't need to be in California per se, but I think the palette is very much, especially when you look at later work, it's very, very different. And also the kind of refracting of light that he's interested in a lot. This one behind us, I had originally read as a lens or a prism kind of refracting light. But David unearthed this sketch where if you look on the left, there's this very cryptic, which we were trying to figure out, is it sort of Latin or is it astrology or what is it? And it's actually, it seems to be this permutation of the word harvest. And what then, and I don't know if this is the case, but what then sort of clicked for me is there's an image also of this vertically. Yeah. And I think then this is more you're supposed to read it as a bushel of wheat. Yeah, and that it's been harvested and that it's this bounty. But on its side and next to something like the God plug from which
is all about light.
Yes. Then it's completely read in a different way. And I know you had mentioned that he's shown it both ways. So I think he's exploring kind of this interesting kind of ambiguous territory. But I think at the end, the short answer to your statement is I think he needed to get away. Mm-hmm. But I think in a way California allowed this palette to come together. I think he just needed to go somewhere.
I would also say, there was such a pull to New York. Mm-hmm. Joe was up there and friends were up there. But he went there twice in this 2-year period, and both times came back realizing It's just not right for me right now. And I think he loved the rural nature of California and just loved the beauty of it a lot.
Where were you in the early 80s?
That's a tough question.
But I mean, oh, sorry. I didn't mean psychologically, I meant physically. Sorry, David.
That's that everybody in the room.
On drugs, all right.
I had finished Duke, and then I was living in Toronto when he was out in California. So, you know, the two Wilcox boys were very far from Denison that year. And then I went from Canada to Cambridge.
And it remained there.
Yeah. So.
What I think is interesting is that, you know, one of the difficulties of being a very well-trained art historian in dealing with material like this is that we're used to looking at things about which you can also read. And there is a kind of verbal realm of criticism and opinion and whatever that one can use as a way of getting to the objects. And these are objects that don't have that. So you're like defenseless. I mean, it's you and them, you know, dealing. Yeah. And we're not sort of trained to know how to do that. And could you talk about it?
Well, for me, I mean, having David and these other resources around me to kind of get a sense, it was interesting. I saw the YouTube clip because I had never met John, but then seeing him talk about his work, and I think this was much later in his life, but and I did, when we were here for the first night, to see how he lived in the space, which was very eclectic. Which, to be honest, was also what California was at the time he visited. I mean, this pluralism of forms, of artists working there. I mean, you can't really put your finger on one thing that was going on. So in that way, in the way that you can't categorize this, he fits into a category of that moment. But I mean, even you're absolutely right. There's something very cryptic to not only the forms, but his use of text. And I think it's because they're so absolutely private. And I also think you had mentioned that these were never really shown publicly. Right. I mean, other than in his home or, you know, in private domestic spaces, but these were never exhibited, correct? These is like the kind of first time.
A few of them were shown in a young artist group show at Delavan.
Okay.
And the one on the entry wall out here, the bat piece, and the comic Thunderbird. And please don't worry, I actually have Delavan stickers on the back. A show.
How interesting.
Yeah, 4 artists that I put together for Laura Carpenter or Smithers. And so.
Did Laura?
She knew, I mean, she was there.
Yeah. All right, we're not going there yet.
It wasn't a show that, everything sold out, obviously, but it was a small exhibition, probably during the summer, of 1980.
I mean, the one thing for me, especially in this body of work that shows through, is how painterly. I mean, he's like a painter's painter.
Totally.
Which
they're all about the surface.
I mean, and having not gone through the MFA, you're almost like, well, what would have happened had he gone? I think it would have gone in a completely opposite direction, because the painting that was going on at Pomona, I don't think was nearly as strong as other things that were going on there. But he obviously didn't need that. I think he needed to clear his mind. And there is, I mean, the palettes are so funky and really unique. There's that one in the back. It has a very strange title.
DigiDitchz SuperNova.
Yeah, there you go. And if you look at that, similar to the sort of these kind of refracting blues and purples and greens. It has this really incredibly deep purple, but it's not unified. It's sort of, as the more you look at it, it kind of splits apart like an Ad Reinhardt, something like that. So he had a mastery of color, mastery of kind of touch.
But also design. I mean, there's this sense of these forms that are reduced.
Yeah.
I mean, we're all reading the obituaries of the great Italian graphic designer who died 2 days ago, and he would love these.
Yeah.
Because each of the forms is distilled, and we're not quite sure from what.
Yeah.
And that's the interesting thing.
Yeah.
You know,
There's a
is
kind of
that a
sleuthing
mouth?
that has
Is
to
that
go
an
on.
air?
Yeah.
Or you know, is it an atomic thing with something in front of it?
Yeah.
And the interesting thing for me about having this space is coming into it over and over, and each of the paintings have this way they stick in your mind because they're so graphic.
Yeah.
And then what is in your mind is very different from the painting. So when you come back and you look at them, like that sort of swirling thing around this, the way that when you look at that deep blue paint, which isn't black, in back of it, and it goes in this kind of swirl. And what's that about? And is that about something that's I didn't know about the sheaf. I think that's fascinating.
I literally just came to that. When you sent me that note, I was like, okay, harvest.
Yeah.
And then I saw that other picture where it's on its side, and I was like, that's not light.